Thank you, George, and thanks for your continued support to ESI, so that's the short name now. I won't use European Social Inclusion Initiative, I will use ESI. And so I have the pleasure to be one of the co-chairs of ESI with Sule, and to introduce this session about our work in Europe. So actually, let me start by introducing the two speakers. And then I will tell you a few words of ESI, and then you will have some results of studies that have been conducted as ESI-funded studies or as precursors of ESI-funded studies. So let me start with Eliana. So Eliana Ferrara is a professor of economics at Behaghel University and chair in development economics. She directs the Laboratory for Effective Anti-Poverty Policies. She has conducted research on development economics, political economics, with a specific focus on social norms, aspirations, which she will illustrate today. She has also worked on political constraints to development in Africa, conflicts, etc. She has been the president of BREAD, which is a great organization in development economics. She's been also the president of the European Economic Association, and last but not least, she is an active JPAL affiliate and a contributor to ESI. So we'll have the pleasure to hear you in a minute. And Sule is a professor of economics at the European University Institute in Florence. You're also adjunct professor of economics at Bilkent University in Turkey. And so you're leading the humanitarian and the displaced livelihood initiatives at JPAL. So this is a teaser because in a minute I will tell you more about these initiatives as I have a chance to co-chair DLI with you. And Sule has worked a lot on the role in particular of schools, of education in the social inclusion process. And this is work that has been very influential in the economics profession, among policymakers as well. So I'm sure we will learn a lot from your presentation. But before that, let me set the stage a little bit and talk to you about ESI. So hopefully, at that stage of the colloquium, you've realized no one in the room anymore believes that research against poverty can be done by a researcher alone in a lonely way in the ivory tower. If you still believe that, I hope we have a chance to definitely change your mind. And so it's definitely a collective endeavor. Each project, as you saw with Pôle emploi this morning, involves so many stakeholders. Starting, of course, with those in poverty themselves. But there is something even more collective at JPAL, which is a research initiative. So what is this thing? Well, let me tell you concretely a few words about one of them, ESI. So ESI is this broad endeavor that George already mentioned, in particular triggered by the refugee and migrant waves that Europe has known recently. And so what a research initiative does is to foster research and outreach on a specific topic, in that case, social inclusion, and basically led by dedicated JPAL associates who do most of the work of the initiative, really, to foster the activity. What we do in an initiative is frame an agenda, try to relate it to the broader literature, think about where we have a comparative advantage, where studies are badly needed, selecting and then funding research projects, sharing the results with policymakers and with the broader audience. And so ESI is still a little girl in the galaxy of initiatives, as it was founded only 4 years ago, after, let's say, 2 years of gestation, more or less. And so it started, like other initiatives, by thinking about its agenda, what social exclusion meant, and what social inclusion could be. There was a long literature review process. There was also, maybe I should insist more on that, a scoping exercise where really you meet with potential implementing partners, you discuss with policymakers, you try to see what the main issues are, etc. And then basically you call to the broader JPAL network and say, okay, we would like good proposals, and if possible, especially on these topics. Of course, if you have other questions of interest, don't hesitate. But yeah, we try to foster a kind of collective effort. So most importantly, this is not something that we do only based on the literature. It's something that we do by talking. Basically, we talk a lot to people during these 2 years that come before the initiative, and that basically leads us to say, okay, maybe as a first priority, we're going to start with the education for migrant children. That was kind of the outcome of this process. Then a key step is, and that's really initiative at work, compared to what a single project would do, is to put lots of people in the same room, lots of potential implementing partners, and so that happened at PSC, I think, in 2020, and we call it the incubator. You are in the Startup Nation, so that's the incubator. And what's that? It's a 3-day workshop where we gather potential implementing partners, and we brainstorm. And out of these contacts between researcher, potential implementing partners, some projects start and then apply to call for proposals, etc., and develop. And some of the projects that will come on the next slide are actually the results of this incubator. So it's really a privileged moment for researchers and implementing partners and policymakers to discuss and to go from the big picture to very specific projects that in turn will help us understand the big picture better. So in the interest of time, I won't tell you about all the projects that AZ has funded. Anyway, as it is a baby initiative, it's still a bit too early to give you many results. But as you can see, it has spread already. It has funded quite a few projects, and it has a little bit changed the focus, the concentration of projects, which is to be very much in France. So thanks to AZ, it's gone a little bit further away now. And so there are pilot projects, there are large-scale RCTs, etc. And of course, at the 30th anniversary of JPAL, we will show you all the results of this project and many others. So I'm aware this presentation is probably way too short, but also a bit, I need to stick to the time, and I haven't had the stop sign yet, but I will stop now to leave the floor to Sule and to Eliana. If you're a bit frustrated because we didn't enter into the list of topics of this supported and the study supported by the initiative, then you can just scan this QR code and you will be led to the initiative website where you can learn a lot more. But don't do that now. No, you should first listen to Sule and Eliana. And so let me have Sule first. Thank you very much.
So the stop sign comes from there? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to present my work to such distinguished guests today. I'm going to talk about an agenda and what we learned from that agenda that I initiated in 2018 with very surprising support by JPAL. We weren't expecting, and then it was a wonderfully timed support, and later by JPAL SC. So this project started in 2018, and I'm going to give you some lessons what we learned. This is about the project. The aim of the project was at the time, and still is, to understand how we can build social capital and how that social capital we build, especially in schools, can shape the way we live and can shape the prosperity we actually aim for our lives. So just to step back and tell you what I mean by social capital and prosperity. So I don't think I need to convince you at all that we human beings, we all pursue our own interests to thrive in life, to be successful, but we all know that we can't do that alone. So we need our fellow human beings to be successful, to live happily. We cannot exist without other human beings. So, and we are species that are cooperative, and we are very good at cooperating if we want to, if we have an aim and we have an objective that requires cooperation, we are pretty good at doing that because our survival often depends on this cooperation. So economic prosperity and social prosperity requires social capital, so cohesive and non-toxic environments. When I talk about this, this could be in a country context where the environment should be non-cohesive, you should not be in a war, you should not have intergroup conflicts, you should not have different religious factions or different ethnic factions are fighting. And it could be in a big, large corporation context we also work in. And departments should not be fighting with each other. Within departments, people should be nice to each other and cooperating with each other. And in a school context, which I'm going to talk about, is the same. The kids should treat each other well, and the teachers should treat kids well. So the environment should be nice and cohesive. That's what we mean by social capital. So in an environment where we think social capital is high, is the environment where we see a lot of social connectedness, a lot of friendship, a lot of bonding, and overall a collective will to live for the case of a country and a community. We also see a lot of prosociality, prosocial behavior, like we see trust, we see reciprocity, we see cooperation, and tolerance for differences, whatever those differences could be. And we also see relatively low intra and intergroup violence and conflict. It could be inter-ethnic, interracial. We see less of those in cohesive and communities where social capital is high. And of course, we see less of segregation that could be ethnic segregation or related to socioeconomic segregation. We see less of those. So, yet, with all these advantages for the economic growth, the cohesive environments and social capital is excellent for economic growth. It makes you rich, it makes you happy, yet we do see non-cohesive environments, we see violence, we see conflict everywhere in the world. In many cases, this has deep historical roots. You see a country, you look at a country, you see actually the very tender fault lines, ethnic fault lines, racial fault lines, or sometimes, on top of everything, as something socioeconomically turbulent thing just comes and hits the country, like mass migratory flows or humanitarian disaster, human displacements, which I'm going to focus on today. So that kind of movement can also threaten social capital, social cohesion you already built, however good, however weak it was, but it can shock what you have built already. In those cases, we might need economic and social policies to actually prevent stuff going south further, or policies that actually see this coming and mitigate what's coming. So what I'm going to show you is we can do this by leveraging the power of public education we have been doing for centuries now. And I'm going to show you this can be done, and I'm going to show you in a specific laboratory called what I call Turkey. Okay, Turkey is a country, by the way. Its name changed, but I still use Turkey. So we call it Turkey now. So Turkey is an ideal laboratory to study inter-ethnic cohesion, and so how to build and how you could lose social capital, how you could rebuild in schools for very basic reasons. Turkey itself is an ethnically diverse country. It already has a lot of some tender religious and ethnic fault lines. On top of it, since the start of the civil war, the Syrian civil war in 2011, Turkey experienced a large influx of Syrian refugees. Many of them remain in the border regions of Turkey, but a lot of them actually moved into Istanbul and Ankara kind of cities where they could actually find economic opportunities. What happened was with the agreement between Turkey and EU, starting 2016, Ministry of Education in Turkey started placing these refugee children into classrooms in a kind of nice organized manner in 2016. At the time, the policy looked quite successful. That in a very short period of time, changed the ethnic composition of public schools, and these children at the time are those who don't speak any Turkish. Obviously, they go into Turkish schools, they don't speak any Turkish, and a lot of them at the time had some kind of war trauma. So that overwhelmed the teachers. And Turkish teachers are usually well-educated and very well-trainable teachers, actually, but they were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed by the sheer number of them, basically. So, and nobody actually, it was an orderly movement, but no one gave them a real clear roadmap how to do this. If you, all of a sudden you have 25 kids, all of a sudden you have 5 extra kids who cannot speak the language, and what can you do, what you should do, and the culture is not that proximate, not that close, so we needed to do something about this. So, just to give you at the baseline, in 2018, when I actually started getting into the classrooms, what I have seen before doing anything, this is what we have seen. We have seen great heterogeneity. In some schools, in some classrooms, great integration. In some classrooms, great segregation. So what I'm going to show you is you see 2 classrooms here from the same school. Same school, 2 third-grade classrooms. What you see here, every dot, every head is a kid, a 3rd or 4th grade kid, I can't remember now. But the thing is, what we have here is we go to the classroom and we say, in secrecy, tell me who your friends are in this classroom. So if I say, okay, Luke is my friend, in secrecy, an arrow goes from me to Luke, and of course, the same question is asked to Luke, who's your friend? In secrecy, he may not nominate me, obviously, but he may nominate someone else. So what you see here is, in the first classroom, in the same school, you see the host children, which is represented with green. They hang out each other when you see a bunch of refugee children who nominate each other as their friends. This is what we call a social segregation within a classroom. Yeah? So in the other classroom, literally next door, you see a great integration. So everybody is friends with everybody. Of course, you see some isolated kids over there we call social isolation. The kid says, I have no friends in this classroom. So, but we do have that, but overall you see this difference before we do anything. So we have some work showing that teacher has got a lot to do with this. Teachers' attitude toward migrants, teachers' attitude toward refugee kids could create a classroom like this or a classroom like that. So, knowing this, we decided, and although a lot of the things, when you show this to the teachers were shocked, actually, because a lot of the teachers don't do what they do by just with a deliberate act. They don't want to segregate those kids or anything like that. Their practices actually lead to that. So what we did in the end is like, okay, let's give them something. Let's give them some tools to do this integration better, to make the classroom more integrated, not segregated. So we created an educational program. And then this program, it was a curricular program, but it was an extracurricular program that was given to the kids through teacher training, and it emphasized basically what we call the perspective taking, or what the psychologists call the cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is your ability, your cognitive ability to put yourself into other people's shoes, as simple as that. So, and that is teachable, and that is malleable, especially for kids, so we actually gave the teacher tools to teach these to the kids. So, we evaluated this program after a year. We used 80 primary schools in Southeast Turkey, where a lot of the refugee students were already placed, 40 treatment, 40 control schools, baseline 2018, end line 2019 April for the short term, and then we were able to collect, thanks to SC again, collect long-term data after the schools opened 3 years later, the implementation, the schools opened after COVID-19 pandemic. Just to give you an example of one classroom after the intervention, this is a treated classroom, very segregated at the beginning, This is the same classroom this time. You're looking at the same classroom before and after now, okay? I know before and after doesn't mean much a lot of the times, but you see here an extreme case of extremely segregated classroom. The refugees is R, host is H. Refugees are all friends with each other, host friends with each other. The same classroom 1 year later becomes a very, very integrated classroom after the program. Moreover, we see a significant reduction in social isolation. What was social isolation? Declaring that you have no friends. So you're an isolated kid, you have no friends. We see a great decline in overall, but very much so for the refugee children. So we have a lot of refugee children saying, I have friends, and when we look at the structure of those friendships, we see more reciprocity. So I say, here is my friend, Luke is my friend, he's Syrian, and he nominates me, I'm a friend who's Turkish. So we see these inter-ethnic friendships a lot more. What we also see is significant increase in trust, reciprocity, and cooperation among the kids. So they trust each other more, not only themselves, but also some unknown the stranger, which is very important. There's a huge literature in economics that shows trust is highly correlated with economic prosperity. You have to trust each other to actually get into any economic transactions. So this is very important. We place a lot of weight into these results. What was surprising for us, the program did nothing to teach Turkish or did nothing academic. We did not aim to do so because these kids were coming and going to school. As long as they come and go to school, they learn the local language anyways. What we see here is a treatment had a huge impact on the refugee children's Turkish ability without teaching them any Turkish, which makes a lot of sense because you introduce a program that puts the kids together, they play together, they hang out together. Of course, they learn the local language. You don't need to teach them separately. This is the result we use for the ministry to show, because they were trying to separate the kids, to teach them Turkish first. I said, this is not really going to work for the little kids. You have to put them together. You have to put them together and let them play football for them to learn the local language. Nothing else. So this is hopefully going to work in the future. In the long term, we see still some results persistent despite the fact that we had a devastating pandemic in between and we lost a lot of refugee children. They just disappeared from the system. Some say some went back to Syria, some went to other cities, we don't know, but we lost a lot of them. So they are not in the education system much. But we see with the remainders, the probability of forming inter-ethnic friendship is still very high among the kids who got this program. The effect on trust dissipates a little bit, and we have good reasons for this. And the effect of Turkish language also dissipates. That's normal because everybody eventually learned the local language, so that's not surprising. So I want to end with this slide. I wasn't sure, should I put this slide, should I not put this slide? I was in the field in May, just recently, yes, recently, is launching a new study that involves also refugees. Things are not looking good, not looking good at all, because in 2018, when we were in the field, we weren't seeing much of that. So we see now residential segregation appearing. We see now school segregation. We see now exclusively Syrian or refugee hosting schools, unfortunately. So we see also huge absenteeism among the refugee children. They just come to school and they don't come to school for another month and they come back again. So the language, local language, is not developing. So that's why they don't learn much, unfortunately. So on top of it, I don't know if you're following, so we have now a lot of hate speeches and violence is on the rise, and the recent elections have been using this as a rhetoric, and it's very sad. But I'm optimistic. I'm very, very optimistic because I work with children. When you work with children, you can do lots of things with children, so in schools. So I'm quite optimistic that we can actually push this agenda forward with the help of J. Paul, and create social capital in an environment like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sule, and now let's have Eliana.
Thank you very much, and it's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here. So I want to thank Esther, Abhijit, and J-PAL Europe for inviting me to this wonderful event. And what I'll do today is talk a bit about supporting social inclusion through education in Italy. So education is, as we all know, a key determinant of labor market outcomes and social mobility, and it's unfortunately often the case that marginalized groups in society do not get access to adequate educational opportunities. So what I'd like to do in my 15 minutes today is to discuss two policy interventions that I've been working on in Italy that were aimed at reducing gaps in learning and in opportunities for disadvantaged students. The first one is going to be called EOP, Equality of Opportunity, and it's a career counseling and tutoring program that we implemented about 10 years ago with the goal of improving high school track choice for middle school students, immigrant students in particular. The second is called TOP, and it's a tutoring online program. This one is younger. It was born in 2020 during the pandemic, and it's a remote tutoring intervention that we launched with the goal of coping with school closures, but then eventually scaled and maintained also when schools reopened. And both programs were evaluated rigorously using randomized controlled trials. And in the case of the tutoring online program, actually J-PAL helped us fund one of the editions of this program. So thanks. So let's start with the equality of opportunity, which was a project I worked on together with Michela Carlana from Harvard Kennedy School and Paolo Pinotti from Bocconi. So the Italian schooling system, like many systems in Europe, actually stratifies students into tracks when they go in high school. So in Italy, this happens after the 8th grade, when the kids are around 14 years old, and they have to opt into one of three tracks. The most demanding is called liceo, and it's academic oriented. Typically, students after the liceo will go on to college. Then there's a middle track called technical education, and here you should think of accountants or people, doing becoming a chemist for employment in the private sector, and this can open the road to college, but you can also get white-collar jobs straight out of technical education. And then the lower tier is vocational schools, which typically leads to blue-collar jobs, and you cannot go to college directly. You would need one extra year to make up for some of the studies you didn't do. And different from France, in Italy there's no restriction. You can really enroll where you want, okay? The selection happens later if you fail to pass the grade, but the school somehow tries to influence your choice. There is an official recommendation that teachers provide to the student and to the family. It's not binding, so you can disregard it, but if you imagine families that don't have a high socioeconomic background and that may not know very much about the system, like immigrant families, very often follow this recommendation. And I want to show you what the track choice looks like for native Italian students and immigrant students when we do our best to take students that are comparable in terms of ability. So what you see in this graph is the probability of enrolling either in liceo or technical education, which we're going to call the high track, for native Italians, and that's the green line, or for immigrant kids, the red line. And you see 5 bins because those are the 5 quintiles of ability as measured through a standardized test that they took 3 years earlier, okay? So the people on the left are gonna be the lowest quintiles, the least academically performing kids, And of course, as you move to the right, you have the better kids. So these lines are positively sloped. It means that as you are better in school, you are more likely to enroll into these demanding tracks. But you see there is a wedge, a pretty consistent difference between native Italians and immigrants, and the immigrants are systematically less likely to go into these good high schools, even though the system is not preventing them. Interestingly, this is the graph for boys. If you look at girls, you still see a gap in the lower quintiles. So when the girls are not very proficient, they're still making different choices. But the high-performing girls in the right part of the graph, in this case, whether they're immigrant or native Italians, they make the same choices. And this is per se an interesting fact. But let me not spend time on this. Let me tell you what teachers might have done to contribute this. In this graph, you see the probability that the teachers have recommended the high track when they sent this message back to the kid's family. And again, the blue line is for Italian students, the red one for immigrants. This time around, both for boys and for girls, if you take two kids who are performing in a similar way when they take tests, and that's the horizontal axis, you see that the teachers are more likely to say, oh, if it's a native Italian, they should go to the better schools, okay? So what did we do? With the Ministry of Education, we implemented a program that was targeting high-performing immigrant students in middle schools, and the goal was to help them make choices that were consistent with their academic potential. In particular, the program was providing two types of activities. One was career choice consultancy, basically meeting with counselors and getting some psychological support to reinforce your perception that you can achieve the goals you set for yourself. And this was done during grades 7 and 8 for a total of 14 meetings. And then for those who were not so good in the Italian language, there was some tutoring activity on the side, because the concern was that if we push these students to aim at demanding schools, but then they were less prepared, we might actually not be doing their best interest. And the total sample of schools that we worked with was 145 in 5 different provinces in Italy. And in each of these schools, we took the 10 immigrant children who were best in that school, okay? So different from some of the work that's been done here in France with immigrant children, where the target were the lowest performing immigrants, this program was a bit more of an upward mobility type of intervention. So we wanted high performing kids. And in the treatment schools, these 10 kids received this counseling and tutoring. And in the control schools, we simply collected data on them. So here you see the results. The blue bar on the left tells you what fraction of these immigrant kids chose the high track, so the liceo or the technical, in the schools where we did nothing. And you see it's something around 67%. So it's not too low, because these are the 10 best immigrant students in the school, okay? The white bar to the right is the choice of native Italians that were comparable when they started, okay? So this is not the entire population of native Italians, otherwise the bar would be higher, but comparing the test scores, this is a group that was similar when they started middle school. And so if we had done nothing, the red bar in the middle would have moved like the blue bar, because, you know, that's the counterfactual we're using. And instead, 2 years after our intervention, their choice had basically become the same as that of the native Italian. So what we did was we closed the gap in aspirations, educational aspirations of these immigrant boys. When we look at girls, nothing happened. Why? Because we saw earlier that the girls were not choosing any different from the native Italians already. This is something that we didn't know before starting the program because the data had not yet been matched. So we could have saved some money if we do and just targeted boys, but we learned through the program that this was one of the facts. And we tried to investigate why was it the case that they changed their choices, and we had a few potential mechanisms. It turns out that students' motivation and teachers' recommendations played the biggest role. These students also did better in school. We find effects on academic performance, but in this mediation analysis, the performance was not really responsible for the choice. So let me move to the second intervention, which is the tutoring online program, and this is also joined with Michela. So TOP, I'm gonna call it, is a program for disadvantaged middle school students, where disadvantaged in this case is not equivalent to immigrant, is more general socioeconomic status, language barriers, learning disorders, and it has two key features. The first is that the tutoring is entirely done online. There's a lot of research in education on tutoring programs. Most of that, until recently, was in-person tutoring. The second characteristic of TOP is that the tutors are not professionals, they are not teachers, they're actually volunteer university students who are trained and supervised, but the fact that they're volunteers has two advantages. First, it costs very little. But second, there's a lot of, commitment that these students have, and this intrinsic motivation helps in the relationship with the student. So TOP started in the spring of 2020. You may not remember, I remember very well when the first COVID case was announced in February, and 2 weeks later, schools shut down, and they did not reopen until the fall, okay? And Michela and I immediately started having these perceptions that this was going to be a disaster for students because Italian teachers and the Italian system was not really prepared for remote learning, but also for families that where the parents couldn't help the kids. And at the same time, being professors in universities, we started seeing students who felt very lost. They were themselves in lockdown, they felt, what can I do to help with this situation? And we decided, why don't we ask them to help kids who are in school and tutor them for free? So between April and June, we implemented the first version of TOP. You will understand why we were able to evaluate it, but the results seemed really positive. So we offered a second edition, and now there's been a third and the fourth, and these last two are now in a mode where we are no longer running it as researchers. There's an NGO that manages it, and so it's more scalable if you wish. So we recruited volunteers and schools by sending emails. We said, we are a group of researchers, we want to do this, and we got an amazing turnout. And in the email, we were asking the schools to indicate maximum 3 students per class who could benefit from this program. And also to tell us which subjects they needed help with. And once the parents consented and kids and parents filled in this baseline questionnaire, we entered them into a lottery to receive the program. Why a lottery? Actually, we could have pretty much served everybody if we had the money back in spring 2020, because we got almost 2,000 volunteer tutors in the space of a couple of weeks. The problem was that we were running it out of our offices with student research assistants, and the maximum that we could pay for in terms of training and pedagogical support was 530 tutors. So we basically had to leave half of the families without a tutor. They had been warned in advance that this could be an outcome, but the fact that we ran these lotteries allowed us to evaluate the impact. And these were the results, measured about 2 months after the intervention. So you must think of this as a 3-hour per week program that runs for about 6 to 7 weeks, and these are the results. the left bar shows you the impact on performance in units of standard deviation. So 0.27 of a standard deviation is actually a big effect, okay? So the kids who did not get the tutor were not going to school. Remember, this was lockdown, so possibly this is actually, reflecting that. We also saw improvements in the kids' interest in continuing with education and ambitions in education, so the index of aspirations. Some, although not quite significant effect on grit, locus of control, and a significantly positive effect on well-being, happiness, and less depression among the kids who got the tutor. So if we look exactly at who benefited the most, we see that it's basically kids whose parents do not have a college degree. So these are the estimates that I circled on the left. And kids whose parents have a blue-collar job and whose parents do not work from home. So these were precisely the families that we thought may not be there to help the students through school closures. And when we look at well-being and depression or happiness, the converse, by far the ones that drive this impact were the immigrant students. Why? Because maybe they had less of a network to start with that could keep functioning through social media or something else. So this was the first edition of TOP. As I told you, there were several. Here, I'm comparing TOP 2020 with 2022. 2022 is the first edition that we implemented in a more systematic way with the NGO and everything. And the results are pretty clear. Okay? What we found in terms of academic performance is there, even in a time where there's no lockdown, if school is functioning normally. It's also comparable in terms of magnitude. Everything else, the aspirations, the well-being, and so on, once the kids are back in their normal social life, the tutor is no longer as necessary. So I'm going to skip the additional results because I got a threatening stop sign, but I want to show you what TOP looks like today. So there's a funding foundation, LEAP, the small brother of JPA at Bocconi University, conducts the impact evaluation for every round. CHAI is the NGO that implements it, and then the University of Bicocca is the team of pedagogists who help us train and support the tutors. And now we have distribution of digital devices and an online platform where we both track the activity of the tutors and we provide materials for them to use in the tutoring. So there has been interest for this program. We have implemented it, for example, in the Dominican Republic, and I really think this remote characteristic makes it, amenable to reaching realities that might be problematic to staff with highly qualified teachers. But let me stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eliana. Thank you, Sule. So we have 10 minutes for discussion, correct? Yeah, more or less. Okay. So actually, I would start by saying that I liked your last slide, Sule, with this daunting picture of what's happening currently with the recent election in Turkey. I liked it because it tells us that changes are still there, are ahead. While listening to your three stories, these are three success stories in a way. And I liked your slide because you commented it with optimism. You still said, okay, I'm optimistic, and we can be optimistic because we are doing these studies and they show that we can have large impact. So what I suggest for the discussion is keeping the challenges in mind, try to unravel a little bit what makes such successful policy evaluations possible in contexts that are difficult contexts, because how to change behaviors and beliefs on these topics on which people have very strong beliefs, are politically loaded. How also to face the emergency. COVID is a good example. And so I suggest we take a little bit of time to think about what made these successful evaluations possible and what lessons we can derive from that to be realistic optimistic people. And perhaps the first question is, as these are politically loaded questions, people have strong priors, usually, on these issues, what makes integration, how immigrant students should integrate in schools, etc. And a first question to the two of you is, how, when working with the implementing partners, you could foster, or whether there was already a kind of learning mindset, because we know as evaluators that when people are with you and thinking, okay, I want to learn something, then you're already halfway in implementing a project. So where come the from where did the willingness to evaluate and to work with you come in these studies?
I mean, when we first started, there was a lot of will to come up, to see programs, and several things were being distributed and done, but it was just not very systematic. So evaluation was in nobody's mind. In fact, when we started doing the perspective-taking study, as soon as before even we got any results, it's like, can we do it to the other classrooms? Can we do it to other schools? That was the will. So, but we held them to do the evaluation. But later on, things changed. That's what I had my last slide because of that. It's like we are now in the field. We see completely different scene, actually. We have, in 2018, we did not have residential segregation. We did not have schools exclusively refugee. And we did not have completely overwhelmed, rundown, and I don't want to think about it anymore kind of teachers. So I think at this point, people are still open to programs, trying different things and finding out what is the best way of handling this problem. But we have to be a lot more creative to make the people who are actually dealing with this in the field happier. So anything that is coming from outside or at the top, do this, do that, that was at the beginning, that was a problem. Like UNICEF would come and it's like, this is the way you do. This is how you integrate. And then that didn't work for the Turkish context, and then that was a lot of problem. But later on, what we know now is we need very creative, maybe targeted in different regions, different programs for refugee integration. And dealing with the kids is easy. I mean, they are so happy to pick up anything you give, but dealing with now adults is becoming harder and harder in these regions.
So the two programs were actually quite different in terms of how I would answer your question. The first one was handed to us, basically by the Ministry of Education, saying, there's this foundation, they want to fund this, I have the schools on board, I need evaluation. So that's easy, we didn't have to persuade them, they were interested in figuring out whether they could do something. The sour side of this is that even after seeing the results, eventually it was so expensive that the ministry couldn't scale it. So they learned that it worked, but they should have done a version, for example, without the academic tutoring, which was a component that we found had very little to do with the effects, and that would have made it much cheaper. And at that point, maybe the enthusiasm had gone down. So I see that as maybe, not such a great message after all, because you find impact. You say, okay, maybe we can try a little bit of an alternative, to cut down a bit on costs so that it becomes feasible. And at that point, nobody follows up. The second one started with a lot less ambition, basically us emailing the principals directly. It was very clear that the principal was the key. Some principals were super responsive. Others were so responsive, but also helpless, because they said, look, things are falling apart to such extent that if I ask the kids to log in for 3 more hours, they're just going to stop following. And others didn't get back to us. But once the principals were on board, there was no need to persuade anybody about the evaluation. They saw the potential usefulness, and even now, we report the findings when we approach them, but they have a pretty clear mind that if they can get tutors for certain students, not much harm can come. One qualification I would maybe give is that these evaluations in Italy are with the schools are very disadvantaged, especially in the last 2 rounds, but the university students are committed, well prepared. It's been a lot harder in the Dominican Republic to find tutors who, can adjust to the task. You need to kind of improvise, help with this homework, do that. And so the supply side of volunteers who have the skills might not be so easy to create as in the Italian example. So I would say we should qualify that success story, but that I see more of a success story because I see, following up, the funder came afterwards because of what we did, and now we are experimenting. We tried group tutoring, then we figure out it's better to go back to individuals. So there's quite a process there, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Maybe stage 2 in this project, so you've already anticipated on stage 3, but I'm still a little bit curious about stage 2, which is you're changing the behaviors of some players, so teachers in particular. When we do economics of education, we know it's not always easy to change behaviors of teachers. And again, I would insist, you're doing that in emergency situations that may help, but that may also not help because they have many things to do, and perhaps it's hard for them to take as a priority a new intervention or to learn about potential interventions, etc. So I guess my general, and having in mind all the difficulties and the political debates on integration, any hints from this study on, what are productive way of changing behaviors, of changing beliefs, and how we as researchers can help, I guess.
I just want to say something here that I think one of the things I'm learning is how you frame the program. So when you frame the program, like what is this good for? How is this going to help the host kids and the refugee kids and the teacher and the country in general? It was super important. So you don't go and say, okay, we are here to help the refugee children. Because you're already in a very, very disadvantaged setting in Turkey. All the children need all the help they can get, right? So, and that really backfired for a lot of people, right? So it's like, what about the other kids? They are not looking good either, right? So, so the idea of a program that the cohesion building, let's do this together, like let's hold hands, right? So without actually making any ethnicity salient. So all the areas that I was working, there were Kurds, there were Turks, there were Arabs. They were on top of it, they were Syrian refugees. So if you don't make this salient, kids never make that salient anyways. So to me, it was very clear at the beginning that sort of program would be successful. And that's why I advise the program to be like that, not targeting a particular group, but targeting the community, the school community in that. I think that is important, how we frame, how we design the programs, and to listen the field, the implementers, actual implementers. In my case, it was teachers.
So our experience with teachers, especially in the first program, I showed you that graph that showed that they are much more likely to tell a native Italian, go to a good school. That triggered something in us. We felt, oh, these teachers are so biased. Okay? And Italy is a country of relatively recent immigration, so there's less familiarity, and not necessarily these teachers were biased because they were bad. They might have thought, oh, the family won't be able to follow through with the support that a certain type of high school would need, and so on. But we weren't sure about whether they knew about their own attitudes or not. So in a subsequent project, we actually tried to measure those using measures from psychology of implicit bias, and we decided to tell some of the teachers what their score was on these measures. And it turns out that after learning their scores that were pretty bad across the board, those teachers that we gave the information to started changing their grading and becoming, less biased towards immigrant and more fair in their assessment of immigrant and native students. And Michela is now trying to launch a new program where she, instead of taking these psychological measures, she just uses administrative data, computes the share of kids that a given teacher has recommended for one track, another track, based on their ability, and just gives them information. It says, do you know that you sent this fraction of immigrant student to that school? And then matching it with the success in terms of retention rates and so on later on, tells them, here is how they did in these schools. So I do think that one way of dealing with the bias that's built in the system, maybe from lack of experience, if not from explicit intentions, is to give people information about how they behaved in the past, or what their cognitive mechanisms seem to suggest about implicit bias. It might not solve every problem, but it seems something that's not particularly costly to do. And we haven't faced resistance when we did that. Actually, people are curious, they want to know.
Oh, 1 minute, but there's still one question. I was thinking about, what we want is to have impact at as large a scale as we can. And for that, actually, I could see two ways from your studies. One, which is the usual way we think about it. Well, let's scale up these studies and let's develop these programs at a larger scale. But also thinking about all the difficulties we have in the public debate to go beyond some very strong prejudices against migrants and the possibility of integration. One way your study could be very useful could be simply to be in the public debate, that people realize that simple things make big difference. So is it something that came out, through the media coverage, or so direct reaction from the public opinion to your studies and not necessarily through policymakers? So I don't know if that's something that happened or if it's just a wishful idea that came to my mind at the last minute.
So I can start with this. It's another one of the maybe small disappointments, no, but small. So there was a little bit of coverage, especially the more recent one, after the pandemic, when we saw those results, we're like, wow, we need to have it out. But not so much because, we did a great study, because at that time it seemed such a hopeful message in terms of mobilizing volunteers in the space of less than 4 weeks, running it. And so to me, I was proud of being Italian. I thought in this country, people still have the willingness to help when it matters. And then I gave it to the press office of my universities. They tried to send it to newspapers. There was a little bit of coverage, but nothing major. And then a few weeks later, I think one of the tutors, I don't know if they posted something, or basically they ran a huge story, but more on the tutor experience, no mention of the evaluation of the results. It was kind of less scientific, and I was still happy that they were talking about the program, but part of me thought, the incentives of the media are not really driven by what you can tell them about the success of a program. They try to see what's the best story. If I talk about some Bocconi professor, people won't read. If I talk about this student with this interesting story, and maybe it's right that way. But so I think one of the, just to tie up with maybe the goal of these 2 days, one of the great services that JPA is doing, in my view, to the profession is that they're also trying to make this research and these stories a little closer to what the general public can understand and likes to hear. And sometimes as researchers, we fail in that dimension, or at least I still have a lot to learn in that respect.
Yeah, also the situations that we work in, and JPAL totally recognizes that this is also wonderful, that continuously changing, especially if you're working in a humanitarian setting. One program that worked in that context, all of a sudden the context changes, right? So then you communicate this evidence, and then you say, okay, scale up is not costly, let's scale it up. But the context already changed. For example, the segregation started, or the public opinion completely turned because there's now economic hardship. You have to think about something else, and then launch something else very fast, which is what we like to do in the new JPAL initiative, right? So if you're working in settings like this, the situation is very dynamic, problems change very quickly, and you have to be quick in program design and evaluation.
Thank you so much. So we've exhausted our time. So let me stop here to thank you and to thank all who made it possible, this initiative, including Community Jamil and Porticus and those who followed. And now all the promises with the Displaced Livelihood initiative that will be the twin initiative complementing this one. So thanks a lot to everyone for your patience, and time for coffee break, and we are back at 10 to 4, correct? 10 to 3, sorry. Oh. At 4. Okay, so we're meeting at 4.